so I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, lived there a year. And then my father, that was in 1939, and my father then moved to Washington to work at the Naval Research Labs for the war effort. And so my first memories are of Washington, D.C. and things like the victory parades at the end of the war and things like that. So, but then we moved, my father then after the war moved to Bell Labs. So we moved to New Jersey. And so I went to grade school in New Jersey. I don't know, there's not a whole lot to say about that. But so, I had a fairly normal childhood growing up. I mean, we'd play catch and, we'd go, we spent a couple of summers in the Tetons going hiking and so on. But then my father decided he preferred university life and things weren't working out quite as well as he'd hoped at Bell Labs in terms of personalities. So he accepted a position at the University of Illinois, and there, I started the sub-freshman year at University High School in Urbana, Illinois, which I think has a reputation for having the highest number of Nobel Prizes per capita or something. In terms of, it's a small school. I mean, it's like 200 students for five grades. And they have the combined sub-freshman and freshman year as one. So they have 7th and 8th grades as 1 year for, you have to pass an exam to get in, but then they sort of open it up more broadly, but it's still, a very small school. So I guess our freshman year, I had a very good math teacher, Max Biberman, who, was famous. Well, he was one of the big developers of the new math in the U.S. I don't know how widely that's known, but anyway, it's a new way of teaching math. Now, the math course we had was not the new math. It was just sort of a fairly traditional course, but anyway, but then that was the last math course I took in high school. And I sort of studied on my own, for the rest of it. But the one sort of bad grade I got in high school was in my freshman year. I took an exam for to pass the algebra course, right? And I got a C. And the reason was that I found it so easy that I had to, I did all the calculations in my head and didn't show my work. And so they downgraded my results because I just gave the answers and didn't show how I got them. Anyway, but so I went through and studied, my senior year studying calculus, but it was a stimulating place, and there were a lot of smart kids, and then I graduated and went to Harvard for college, and was a national merit scholar and so on. So, and the other thing I did my senior year in high school was this Westinghouse Science Talent Search, which was a national sort of competition for aspire young scientists. So, and that was exciting. I got to go to Washington, D.C. and meet a lot of other smart people. So, but anyway, so at Harvard, I majored in physics, and actually, my father was perhaps a little disappointed because he thought the really coming thing in science was, the DNA and the biological sciences was, this was around the time of the figuring out, the genetic code and things like that. So that was, but I was like physics, and my father certainly did not push me into doing relativistic astrophysics. I mean, as I said, I think was a little disappointed I didn't go into molecular biology, which he thought was the really exciting field at the time I was, going to college. But anyway, it wasn't by any means being force-fed physics. But, my father was, of course, enormously accomplished physicist and won two Nobel Prizes for quite different things, each of which are enormously important. So, and the amusing story maybe is that his first Nobel Prize in 1956 for the transistor, he did not bring me with him to Sweden. He thought, I was in my freshman year at Harvard at that point, and he thought it was more important that I should stay and, write my term papers and study for exams and so on, than go to the Nobel ceremony in Stockholm. And he was roundly chastised by the king of Sweden for doing that. and my brother also, the only child he brought was my sister, who was younger, 5 years younger. So then, as for a second Nobel Prize, he had to make sure to bring everybody. I mean, not only all the children, but several other relatives, and so I did go to Stockholm for the second Nobel Prize ceremony. But my father is very sort of, well, he doesn't impose himself on others, shall we say. So we felt we had the freedom to do what we, wanted to do in terms of careers. Though both my brother and I ended up in physics, I think perhaps just because he didn't try to force us into physics. My sister married a physicist, so it was very sort of ingrown in that sense, but not because of any great influence from my father. It was just because he didn't try to, force us and so, but just by osmosis, we sort of decided physics was a great thing to do. My mother was not a physicist, so she had some training in biology and taught biology, and before she got married, but well, there were certainly, I mean, they'd have occasional parties where they invited other people from the physics department and so on. So we got to know people, but as I said, my father is no sort of silent John. He didn't talk that much, about his work at home. I mean, so uh, we're aware that more or less what I was working on, but not, it wasn't a constant exposure anyways. I'm sure it's had an effect. I mean, I don't think he ever tried to intervene directly in my career in a sense. But certainly people know who my father is, shall we say. And that, I'm sure, has had some effect, but it's hard to know exactly how much. That much. I mean, I was doing things I was interested in and found enjoyable. And, I certainly did try to do well in college and grad school, but I don't think I particularly felt that, I had to live up to his name or something. I figured that was sort of impossible anyway. I haven't won a single Nobel Prize. In high school, I was certainly at the top of my class in a lot of ways. My brother, who was sort of more rebellious as a child than I was. I mean, I was sort of a dutiful son, right, in the sense of not acting out, particularly, or, being pretty straight arrow. My brother, I think partly because of his, sense of competition with me, right? This younger brother had some issues, but again, I think more because of me than my father, probably. But in the end, he turned out. I mean, so through high school, he didn't shine academically quite the extent that I did, but then he had a very good. He became a member of the National Academy well before I did, so he's had a very distinguished career. And there at Harvard, I would say, so I had some, well, Ed Purcell was a sort of an inspiration. He was, I took a course from him. And then senior year, I took a graduate course in quantum mechanics from Schwinger, which was interesting because he had a way of, he'd give these, very elegant, lectures. It was all on sort of very basic ideas about quantum mechanics, but we barely got to the hydrogen atom by the end of the year. but he gave very elegant lectures. But then he would sort of, as he was finishing, he would sort of gradually edge towards the door of the classroom and then disappear immediately. So there's no chance to, asking questions at the end. But anyway, so that was sort of interesting. And then I went to Caltech for graduate school. So I was, interested in astrophysics. And my first project was on the stellar wind. This was the time when there was a controversy about, whether the solar wind was supersonic or subsonic and things like that. So I had a little sort of toy research project. It was never published, deciding that the Parker theory of the solar wind made more sense than the other one. But anyway, the Chamberlain one. So, but then, now this was in the early 60s. I started in 1960 and 60 and graduated, got my PhD in 65. So it was an exciting time in astrophysics because quasars were discovered in 1963, I think, or 62 or 63, by Martin Schmidt at Caltech. So there was a lot of interest in understanding how you could have these enormously amount of energy being released in the nucleus of a galaxy, and so for my PhD thesis, I studied stability of supermassive stars, because one of the early ideas about a possible energy source was you just had a very big star with millions of solar masses, but it quickly became clear that they were very unstable and had very small binding energies. And it was not a good way to power a quasar. And of course, then there was the Kerr metric in 1963, which took a little while to sort of people to figure it out, but as well, of course, people knew about the Schwarzschild metric, and by that time there was a pretty good understanding of what the Article 2m singularity in the Schwarzschild metric was not a physical singularity. It was just a point at which the space-time started to collapse, basically, inside that radius. So, and it was a causal boundary, but not any sort of singularity in it. So there's an idea, and so there were ideas about, that this might be a way of generating energy through the gravitational binding energy of stuff being released as the stuff falls in. Now my PhD advisor was actually Richard Feynman. This was a time when Feynman was in a somewhat fallow period between his work on, in the 50s, and then later on partons and so on, and got back into particle physics. And but he was interested in quantizing gravity, and I took a course in general relativity and from Feynman, and he, first part was very nice, typical Feynman-esque, very physically clear exposition of classical general relativity. But then he started going into quantum, and he would write down this, these very complicated Feynman diagrams, and trying to figure out a way of renormalizing gravity and so on. And he sort of lost me there. But I did do my thesis for him. But actually, I wouldn't say he was a big mentor so much, because I didn't have all that much contact with him, and he spent most of his time in tapas bars and things at that point. And so I had to make, to see him, I had to make an appointment, special appointment. And it was all, sort of go in with my knees shaking. But the person who actually was probably more inspiring to me was, or in terms of my actual work, was Willie Fowler, who was very interested in supermassive stars and things like that. And how to explain the energy source. So I also should say that my first year in grad school, I roomed with Jim Hartle in a graduate dorm at Caltech. And so I got to be good friends with Jim Hartle at that point. Though Jim finished his PhD well before I did, but it was on the three-body problem and quantum mechanics, and had nothing to do with relativistic astrophysics. But but I also, well, so around the time I finished my PhD, I got to know Kip Thorne, who had been a grad student at Princeton. And so we didn't really overlap at Caltech. I mean, he was an undergraduate when I first couple of years in graduate school, but at Caltech for my first couple of years in graduate school, but or a year or so, I don't know. But I didn't know him at all then, and but we were both interested in stability of relativistic stars and things like that. So I got to know him, and we got to be good friends. And he came to Caltech actually just after I left Caltech, and was able to go to the GR4, I guess, in London in the fall, in summer of '65. And there I met Stephen Hawking for the first time. He was still a graduate student, but really, extremely bright person. And at that point, he was able to get around in crutches. He wasn't, but he was definitely. But anyway, so that was inspiring, and then I went to Berkeley, where I was a postdoc with Abe Taub, who actually had known, because he was at the University of Illinois before he went to Berkeley, and his daughter was a classmate of mine, and one of his daughters was a classmate of mine at this university high school. So but anyway, he was, he was basically, he considered himself a mathematician, but he was quite interested in general relativity and variational principles and things like that, which are related to stability of rotating stars and things like that. So that was, and I remember going to lunch with a group of physicists there, including Steven Weinberg, who was there at Berkeley that year. But then, just after 1 year, I had a career choice. At the end of that is I had offers from Chandrasekhar at the University of Chicago, and an offer to join a very fledgling astronomy department at the University of Washington. Well, the obvious career choice is go to the University of Chicago, but I was very into things like mountain climbing, skiing, and then I decided to go to the University of Washington, even though I was a little hard pressed to teach some astronomy courses because my background was really physics and not astronomy.